The day Colonel Marcus Shaw became the most respected man in Riverside Valley was the same day a group of misguided protesters nearly cost him everything he'd worked 20 years to build. What started as a routine military convoy transporting humanitarian supplies to disaster victims became a standoff that would expose the ugly truth about performative activism and reveal the power of quiet professionalism over loud outrage. Colonel Shaw commands the 47th Engineering Battalion, stationed at Fort Riverside, a modest military installation that serves as a staging ground for disaster relief operations throughout the Pacific Northwest. At 42, Shaw has dedicated his entire adult life to service. First as an enlisted soldier in Afghanistan and Iraq, then working his way up through the ranks to become one of the youngest battalion commanders in his division. His unit specializes in rapid response humanitarian missions, building bridges in flood zones, establishing clean water systems after earthquakes, and coordinating supply distribution during natural disasters. The battalion's relationship with the surrounding civilian community has always been complicated. Riverside Valley evolved from a rural farming community into a progressive college town over the past decade, attracting environmental activists, anti-war protesters, and social justice advocates who view the nearby military base with suspicion and hostility. The city council, dominated by former Berkeley professors and Portland transplants, has repeatedly attempted to restrict military vehicle access through town, citing noise concerns and militarization of civilian spaces. Shaw's convoy that morning consisted of 12 heavy trucks loaded with emergency medical supplies, water purification equipment, and temporary shelter materials destined for flood victims in Northern California. The route through Riverside Valley represented the fastest path to the disaster zone, where families had been without clean water for 3 days following unprecedented rainfall that washed out roads and contaminated municipal water systems. What Shaw didn't know was that his convoy would become the target of opportunity for the Peace and Justice Coalition, a loosely organized group of activist organizations planning a coordinated demonstration against American military imperialism. Led by sociology professor Dr. Rebecca Martinez and her graduate students, the coalition had spent weeks organizing what they called direct action resistance against military activities in their community. The chapter establishes the fundamental conflict between Shaw's mission-focused professionalism and the activists' ideological opposition to anything military-related, setting up a confrontation where good intentions clash with practical necessity, and where the real victims, flood survivors waiting for supplies, become pawns in a larger political game. Dr. Rebecca Martinez stands at the intersection of Highway 101 and Main Street at 6:30 a.m., her breath visible in the cool morning air as she coordinates the positioning of protesters across the roadway. As a tenured professor of social justice studies at Riverside Community College, Martinez has built her career on what she calls intersectional resistance theory, the academic framework that justifies blocking military operations as a form of social activism. The Peace and Justice Coalition has attracted over 200 supporters for this morning's action, a mix of college students earning extra credit for civic engagement, local environmental activists concerned about military vehicles damaging roads, and a core group of professional protesters who travel from demonstration to demonstration across the Pacific Northwest. Martinez has carefully studied successful blockade tactics from other movements, implementing strategies designed to maximize media attention while minimizing immediate legal consequences. The protesters have created an impressive display of organization and commitment. Students have chained themselves to concrete barriers positioned across both traffic lanes, while others form human chains linking arms between the fixed obstacles. Banners reading "No military violence," "Peace not war," and "Demilitarize our community" create a colorful backdrop for the news crews that Martinez invited to document what she frames as citizen resistance to militarism. Martinez's motivation stems from her graduate work at UC Berkeley in the 1990s, where she participated in similar anti-military protests and developed her theoretical framework around disrupting the military-industrial complex through grassroots resistance. Her doctoral dissertation, Embodied Resistance, Civil Disobedience as Counter-Hegemonic Praxis, provides the intellectual justification for today's action. To Martinez, blocking military vehicles represents a principled stand against American imperialism, regardless of the specific mission those vehicles might be conducting. The coalition includes several key organizers who bring different motivations to the blockade. James Harrison, a local environmental lawyer, sees military convoys as violations of environmental protection ordinances and opportunities to challenge what he considers illegal use of civilian infrastructure. Sarah Chun, a graduate student in peace studies, views the demonstration as her thesis research in action, documenting community resistance to state violence for her academic work. Most protesters genuinely believe they're participating in a morally justified action against militarism and war. They've been told that the convoy represents training exercises for overseas deployments and normalization of military presence in civilian spaces. Martinez's briefing materials, distributed the night before, describe the operation as psychological warfare against local communities in preparation for domestic military operations. What the protesters don't know, and what Martinez hasn't bothered to research, is the actual purpose of Shaw's convoy. The humanitarian mission to flood victims doesn't fit the narrative of military aggression that Martinez needs to justify her blockade. In her worldview, all military operations are inherently violent and oppressive, regardless of their stated humanitarian purpose. The chapter reveals the fundamental disconnect between the protesters' abstract ideological framework and the concrete reality of Shaw's disaster relief mission. Martinez's academic theories about resisting militarism sound compelling in university seminars, but they fall apart when applied to soldiers delivering clean water to families whose homes have been destroyed by flooding. As news crews arrive and social media coverage begins, the protesters feel validated in their action. Hashtag block the military and hashtag peace not war begin trending locally, creating the viral attention that Martinez hoped to generate. The demonstration has successfully achieved its primary goal of media coverage and political theater, but it has also created an obstacle that could delay life-saving supplies from reaching disaster victims. At precisely 7:15 a.m., Colonel Shaw's convoy crests the hill overlooking Riverside Valley, and the full scope of the road blockade becomes immediately apparent. 12 military trucks, each weighing over 40,000 pounds when fully loaded, cannot simply turn around or find alternate routes through the valley's narrow mountain roads. The protesters have chosen their location strategically, creating a bottleneck that forces the convoy to either wait indefinitely or abandon their mission entirely. Shaw observes the scene through his passenger window with the calm assessment of someone trained to evaluate tactical situations under pressure. The protesters have established multiple layers of obstruction across Highway 101, with the most committed activists chained to concrete barriers in the roadway center. Police barriers and civilian vehicles create additional obstacles, while news crews and social media live streamers document every moment of the developing confrontation. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, Shaw's convoy commander, provides a professional briefing over the radio. "Sir, we have approximately 200 civilians blocking the primary route. Multiple individuals appear to be physically restrained to permanent barriers. Local police are present, but not actively clearing the roadway. Estimate minimum 2 hours for civilian authorities to restore vehicle access." 2 hours. Shaw knows that 2 hours could mean the difference between life and death for flood victims still trapped in Northern California. The water purification equipment in his trucks can process thousands of gallons per hour, providing clean drinking water to families who have been consuming contaminated floodwater for 3 days. The medical supplies include antibiotics, pain medication, and emergency surgical equipment requested specifically by overwhelmed emergency rooms in the disaster zone. Shaw's radio crackles with updates from his base commander and the Federal Emergency Management Agency Coordination Center. Cherokee 6, this is base actual. FEMA reports critical supply shortages at multiple evacuation centers. Local hospitals requesting immediate resupply of emergency medications. What's your estimated time of arrival? The question forces Shaw to confront the gap between military efficiency and civilian politics. In combat zones, obstacles like roadblocks can be cleared quickly and decisively. But operating within the United States requires a completely different approach, one that respects civilian authority and constitutional rights while still accomplishing the mission. Shaw makes the decision to attempt direct communication with protest leadership, following established protocols for civil-military cooperation during domestic operations. He orders his convoy to maintain safe distance from the protesters while he approaches on foot, accompanied by his public affairs officer and a military liaison specifically trained in civilian interaction. The sight of military personnel in combat uniforms stepping out of the trucks creates an immediate reaction among the protesters. Some begin chanting, "No war, no way, U.S. military go away," while others start recording videos for social media platforms. Martinez approaches with her megaphone, prepared to deliver the confrontational rhetoric that she's practiced for weeks. "I'm Colonel Shaw, commanding officer of the 47th Engineering Battalion," Shaw announces, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades in uniform. "We're conducting a humanitarian relief mission to disaster victims in Northern California. I'm requesting passage for emergency supply vehicles carrying clean water and medical equipment to American families affected by flooding." Martinez's response reveals the fundamental rigidity of her ideological framework. "Colonel, we reject the militarization of humanitarian aid and the use of our community's infrastructure for military operations. This blockade represents our constitutional right to protest American militarism wherever we encounter it." The exchange crystallizes the core conflict: Shaw's practical mission to save lives versus Martinez's abstract principle of resisting militarism. Shaw realizes that he's not dealing with people who oppose this specific mission, but with activists who oppose military involvement in any civilian activity, regardless of context or humanitarian purpose. Shaw attempts to explain the mission's urgency and humanitarian nature, but Martinez interrupts with prepared talking points about military-industrial complex propaganda and the normalization of armed forces in civilian spaces. Her graduate students document the conversation for their research, treating Shaw's explanations as data points in their thesis work rather than information about people who need help. The standoff settles into a pattern that will define the next several hours. Shaw maintaining professional composure while explaining the humanitarian mission, and Martinez delivering ideological rhetoric that treats all military activity as inherently violent and oppressive. Neither side can find common ground because they're operating from completely different frameworks for understanding the situation. Within an hour of the standoff beginning, Riverside Valley transforms into a media battleground where competing narratives about military authority and civilian resistance play out for national audiences. News trucks from Portland, Seattle, and San Francisco arrive to cover what local reporters initially describe as anti-war protesters blocking military convoy, though few journalists have investigated the convoy's actual mission or destination. Dr. Martinez thrives in the media spotlight, providing sound bites that reinforce her academic theories about grassroots resistance to state violence. Her interview with Channel 7 News becomes the defining narrative for much of the coverage. What you're seeing here is ordinary citizens exercising their constitutional rights to resist the militarization of their communities. This convoy represents the normalization of armed force in civilian spaces, and we cannot allow that to go unchallenged. The framing creates a David versus Goliath story that resonates with audiences predisposed to support anti-establishment protests. Social media amplifies Martinez's message, with hashtag #BlockTheMilitary gaining national attention as progressive activists share videos of peaceful protesters standing up to military aggression. The visual of uniformed soldiers facing off against college students creates powerful imagery that obscures the convoy's humanitarian purpose. Shaw finds himself constrained by military public affairs protocols that emphasize restraint and professionalism over emotional appeals. When reporters ask about the mission, he provides factual information. "We're transporting emergency supplies to flood victims in Northern California. Clean water, medical equipment, and temporary shelter materials for American families displaced by natural disaster." But Shaw's measured, professional responses lack the emotional punch of Martinez's passionate rhetoric about resisting militarism. The media coverage reflects this imbalance, with Martinez receiving twice as much airtime as Shaw despite her complete ignorance of the convoy's actual purpose. News segments focus on the dramatic confrontation rather than the humanitarian mission being delayed. The social media narrative becomes increasingly divorced from reality as the story spreads beyond local coverage. Progressive influencers share clips of the standoff with captions about brave activists stopping military violence, while conservative commentators respond with outrage about anti-American radicals blocking disaster relief. Both sides use the incident to advance pre-existing political narratives rather than examining the specific circumstances. Shaw receives updates from his base commander about escalating political pressure to resolve the situation quickly. Cherokee 6, we're getting calls from congressional offices, the governor's office, and FEMA headquarters. Everyone wants this resolved without incident, but flood victims are still waiting for supplies. What's your assessment of civilian cooperation? The political dimension adds another layer of complexity to Shaw's tactical problem. Military leadership wants the mission accomplished without creating negative publicity that could affect future civilian-military cooperation. Local politicians want the protesters cleared without violence that could alienate their progressive constituents. State officials want disaster relief delivered without becoming embroiled in controversy about military authority. Meanwhile, Martinez leverages the media attention to advance her broader academic and political agenda. She schedules interviews with national news programs, positions herself as an expert on civil-military relations, and uses the platform to promote her forthcoming book about community resistance to state violence. The humanitarian crisis that prompted Shaw's mission becomes secondary to Martinez's opportunity for career advancement. The chapter reveals how modern media coverage can distort simple situations into complex political narratives. Shaw's straightforward mission to deliver supplies to flood victims becomes a debate about militarism, civil rights, and the proper role of armed forces in American society. The actual beneficiaries of the mission, families without clean water, disappear from the coverage entirely. As the standoff enters its third hour, Shaw receives devastating updates from the disaster zone that the protesters and media coverage have completely ignored. Radio communications from Northern California paint a picture of deteriorating conditions that make the delay increasingly costly in human terms. Cherokee 6, this is Red Cross Coordination Center. The radio crackles with urgency. We have confirmed cases of waterborne illness at 3 evacuation centers. Local hospitals report increasing admissions for dehydration and gastroenteritis. The water purification equipment you're transporting is critical for preventing a public health crisis. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez plots the convoy's delayed timeline on her tactical map, calculating the human cost of each additional hour of delay. Sir, original ETA was 1,100 hours. Current situation pushes us to 1,500 hours minimum, assuming immediate road clearance. That's 4 additional hours without clean water for approximately 2,000 displaced persons. Shaw faces the impossible calculation that military commanders know well, weighing immediate tactical constraints against strategic mission requirements. Every minute spent negotiating with protesters represents potential suffering for people who don't know their relief supplies are being delayed by ideological theater in a college town 300 miles away. The protesters remain completely unaware of these humanitarian stakes because Martinez has framed the entire situation as abstract political resistance. When Shaw attempts to explain the urgency of the medical supplies and water purification equipment, Martinez responds with prepared talking points about military propaganda and manufactured emergencies designed to justify state violence. Dr. Martinez, Shaw says, maintaining professional calm despite his growing frustration. There are families in Northern California who haven't had clean drinking water for 3 days. Children are getting sick from contaminated floodwater. The equipment on these trucks can provide clean water for thousands of people. Martinez's response reveals the intellectual rigidity that makes productive dialogue impossible. Colonel, we've heard these justifications for military operations before. Haiti, Iraq, Afghanistan. It's always presented as humanitarian aid, but it's really about projecting American power and normalizing military presence in civilian spaces. The comparison of disaster relief for American flood victims to overseas military interventions demonstrates how Martinez's ideological framework prevents her from distinguishing between genuinely different situations. Her academic training has taught her to view all military activity through the same theoretical lens, regardless of context or actual purpose. Shaw realizes that he's not dealing with people who oppose this specific mission based on its merits, but with activists whose worldview requires them to oppose anything involving uniformed personnel, regardless of humanitarian need. The protesters have created an intellectual system that makes compromise or cooperation impossible. The human cost becomes more concrete when Shaw's radio receives direct communication from a field hospital in the disaster zone. Cherokee 6, this is Forward Medical Unit Delta. We have a 7-year-old patient with severe dehydration. Parents have been giving her floodwater because it's the only source available. We need those 4 fluids and electrolyte solutions ASAP. Shaw shares this information with Martinez, hoping that the specific case of a sick child might break through her ideological resistance. Martinez's response shocks even her own supporters. Colonel, this emotional manipulation is exactly how the military-industrial complex operates. You use individual tragedies to justify systemic violence. The accusation that Shaw is manipulating the situation by mentioning sick children reveals the moral bankruptcy of Martinez's position. She has constructed an ideological framework so rigid that acknowledging human suffering becomes manipulation if it contradicts her political narrative. Several protesters begin looking uncomfortable as Shaw's radio communications about medical emergencies become audible to the crowd. Some college students who join the demonstration for extra credit start questioning whether they're really fighting militarism or preventing medical aid from reaching sick children. Jennifer Walsh, a sophomore sociology major, approaches her professor with growing concern. Dr. Martinez, if they're really carrying medical supplies to flood victims, shouldn't we let them through? We're not trying to hurt sick people, right? Martinez's response to her student reveals the authoritarian nature of her academic activism. Jennifer, this is exactly how hegemonic narratives work. They use emotional appeals to make us forget our principles. We cannot allow ourselves to be manipulated by military propaganda about humanitarian missions. The chapter exposes the fundamental cruelty of treating real human suffering as propaganda and real medical emergencies as emotional manipulation. Martinez's ideological purity requires her to dismiss genuine humanitarian need as military deception, creating a moral framework that values abstract political principles over concrete human welfare. As Shaw's radio continues broadcasting updates about deteriorating conditions in the disaster zone, the protest coalition begins showing signs of internal fracture. The abstract principles that motivated many participants start colliding with the concrete reality of delaying medical aid to sick children and families without clean water. Jennifer Walsh isn't the only student questioning the demonstration's purpose. Michael Torres, a senior environmental science major, has enough background in emergency management to understand the significance of water purification equipment during natural disasters. His conversation with fellow protesters creates ripples of doubt throughout the crowd. Look, I'm all for protesting military interventions overseas, Torres explains to a group of students, but this isn't intervention. These are American families who need clean water. My environmental science courses covered disaster response. Waterborne illness can kill people, especially kids and elderly folks. Torres's scientific perspective provides a framework for understanding the situation that Martinez's political theory doesn't address. Several protesters begin accessing news coverage of the Northern California flooding on their smartphones, discovering for the first time the scope of the humanitarian crisis that Shaw's convoy is trying to address. Sarah Chun, Martinez's graduate student, faces a particular crisis of conscience as her thesis research confronts unexpected moral complexity. Her academic work has treated military resistance as an unqualified good, but the reality of blocking medical supplies to flood victims doesn't fit her theoretical framework. Professor Martinez, Chin asked during a brief break from media interviews, "What if we're wrong about this convoy? What if they really are just delivering humanitarian aid? Shouldn't we verify the mission before we block emergency supplies?" Martinez's response reveals the intellectual authoritarianism that characterizes much academic activism. Sarah, critical thinking means questioning all claims made by state actors, especially military personnel. The moment we start believing their narratives about humanitarian missions, we lose our capacity for principled resistance. The circular logic: military claims must be false because they're made by military personnel, demonstrates how Martinez's ideological framework prevents genuine critical thinking. Her critical theory has become a closed system that cannot incorporate contradictory evidence. Meanwhile, James Harrison, the environmental lawyer who helped organize the blockade, begins researching the convoy's legal status and mission authorization. His discovery that the operation has legitimate FEMA authorization and emergency vehicle designations creates legal concerns about the protesters' liability for obstructing disaster relief. Rebecca, Harrison approaches Martinez privately. "I've been reviewing the legal documentation. This convoy has federal emergency authorization for disaster relief operations. If we're blocking legitimate FEMA supplies, we could face federal charges for obstructing disaster relief." Martinez dismisses Harrison's legal concerns with the same ideological certainty she applies to humanitarian arguments. "James, the law is a tool of state oppression. We cannot allow legal technicalities to prevent us from resisting militarism wherever we encounter it." The response alienates Harrison, whose environmental law practice requires him to work within legal frameworks rather than dismiss them as state oppression. His withdrawal from the protest leadership creates the first visible crack in the coalition's unity. Local residents who initially supported the demonstration begin having second thoughts as Shaw's radio communications about medical emergencies become more frequent and urgent. Mrs. Patterson, a retired nurse whose grandson attends Riverside Community College, approaches the protest perimeter with growing alarm. "Excuse me," she calls out to Martinez. "I couldn't help overhearing the radio updates about sick children. Are you really blocking medical supplies from reaching flood victims? Because if you are, that's not protesting war. That's preventing health care." Martinez's response to the elderly nurse demonstrates her complete disconnection from community values. "Ma'am, you're being manipulated by military propaganda designed to make us support state violence. These so-called humanitarian missions are psychological warfare against civilian populations." Mrs. Patterson's incredulous response speaks for many community members. "Young lady, I've been a nurse for 40 years. I know the difference between medical supplies and psychological warfare. Those are sick children we're talking about." The exchange creates a powerful moment of moral clarity that several protesters witness. The sight of their professor dismissing a retired nurse's concerns about sick children as military propaganda forces some students to question Martinez's credibility and judgment. The protest coalition continues fragmenting as participants with different motivations confront the humanitarian reality of Shaw's mission. Environmental activists who join to protest military vehicle emissions realize they're blocking disaster relief. Peace activists who opposed war find themselves preventing medical aid to American families. Only Martinez's core group of graduate students and professional activists maintains ideological commitment to the blockade. For them, acknowledging that Shaw's convoy serves humanitarian purposes would require abandoning the theoretical framework that justifies their entire activist identity. Shaw observes these developments with the tactical awareness of someone trained to assess evolving situations. The protest leadership remains committed to obstruction, but their broader coalition shows signs of collapse as participants learn the true nature of the convoy's mission. The moment that changes everything arrives at 10:47 a.m. when Shaw's radio receives an emergency transmission that penetrates even the most ideologically committed protesters' resistance to reality. The voice belongs to Dr. Amanda Foster, Chief Medical Officer at the Northern California Emergency Response Center. Cherokee 6, we have a medical emergency that requires immediate intervention. 7-year-old Emma Rodriguez went into dehydration shock after her family ran out of bottled water and resorted to drinking contaminated floodwater. We need those 4 fluids and pediatric electrolyte solutions immediately. This child could die if we don't get proper medical supplies within the next few hours. The transmission crackles with the unmistakable urgency of a medical professional fighting to save a child's life. Dr. Foster provides clinical details about Emma's condition: blood pressure dropping, kidney function declining, electrolyte imbalances that could cause cardiac arrest. The medical terminology carries weight that even Martinez's ideological framework cannot dismiss as military propaganda. Shaw immediately responds with precise logistical information. Medical Center, Cherokee 6. We have pediatric emergency supplies, including lactated ringer solution, dextrose, and electrolyte replacement therapy. Current ETA is delayed due to civilian roadblock. Working to resolve immediately. The radio exchange occurs within earshot of dozens of protesters, many of whom have never heard actual emergency medical communications. The clinical reality of a dying child strips away the abstract political framework that Martinez has used to justify the blockade. Jennifer Walsh, who has been questioning the demonstration since morning, now confronts her professor directly. Dr. Martinez, there's a little girl who could die because we're blocking medical supplies. This isn't about protesting war anymore. This is about a child's life. Martinez's response reveals the complete moral bankruptcy of her position. Jennifer, this is exactly how the state manipulates us. They use individual tragedies to make us abandon our principles. We cannot let emotional appeals override our commitment to resisting militarism. The exchange occurs in front of news cameras and live-streaming protesters, creating a moment of televised moral clarity that no amount of academic theory can obscure. Martinez has just dismissed a child's medical emergency as emotional manipulation and state propaganda. Michael Torres, the environmental science student, begins physically dismantling the barriers he helped construct that morning. I'm done with this, he announces to anyone listening. I came here to protest environmental damage, not to let children die. This is insane. His actions inspire other students who have been wrestling with the moral implications of blocking medical supplies. Within minutes, a counter-movement emerges within the protest itself, with participants working to clear the roadway despite their leadership's continued resistance. Sarah Chun faces the collapse of her thesis research as the protest she's documenting becomes an example of ideological extremism rather than principled resistance. Her academic work has assumed that blocking military operations represents inherent moral good, but reality has proven more complex than her theoretical framework can accommodate. Professor Martinez, Chun approaches her advisor with notebook in hand. My research methodology requires me to document all aspects of this action. The humanitarian mission complicates our narrative about resisting state violence. How do I incorporate the medical emergency into my analysis? Martinez's academic response reveals how ideological rigidity can corrupt scholarly inquiry. Sarah, critical theory provides the framework for understanding these events. The so-called medical emergency is manufactured to justify state violence. Your analysis should focus on how military propaganda creates false humanitarian narratives. Chun realizes that her professor is asking her to ignore evidence that contradicts predetermined conclusions, the opposite of legitimate academic inquiry. The request violates everything she's learned about research methodology and intellectual honesty. James Harrison, the environmental lawyer, faces potential legal liability as his research reveals federal statutes that criminalize obstruction of disaster relief operations. His attempt to warn Martinez about serious legal consequences meets the same ideological resistance as humanitarian and medical arguments. "Rebecca, we need to end this blockade immediately," Harrison states with legal authority. Federal law makes it a felony to obstruct emergency relief operations. Everyone participating in this demonstration could face criminal charges for preventing disaster aid from reaching victims. Martinez dismisses legal concerns with the same certainty she applies to medical emergencies. "James, the law is a tool of oppression designed to criminalize resistance. We cannot let legal threats prevent us from fighting militarism." The response completes Harrison's alienation from the demonstration. As a practicing attorney, he cannot participate in an action that violates federal criminal statutes, regardless of its political justification. Mrs. Patterson, the retired nurse, returns with several other community members who have been listening to the radio communications about Emma Rodriguez's medical crisis. Their presence represents the broader community's response to Martinez's extremism. "Young woman," Mrs. Patterson addresses Martinez with the moral authority of 4 decades in healthcare. "I've held dying children in my arms. I know what medical emergencies sound like. If you prevent these supplies from reaching that little girl, you'll have blood on your hands." Martinez's final response crystallizes her complete moral disconnection. These emotional appeals are designed to manipulate us into supporting state violence. "I will not be manipulated by military propaganda, no matter how they frame it." The statement, broadcast live on social media and captured by news cameras, creates a defining moment that exposes the true nature of Martinez's activism. She has just dismissed a child's medical emergency as propaganda and refused to allow life-saving supplies to pass because of abstract political principles. The protest coalition collapses entirely as participants confront the gap between their professors' theories and the reality of blocking medical aid to a dying child. Only Martinez and her most ideologically committed graduate students maintain their position, increasingly isolated from their own supporters. With the protest coalition fragmenting around her, Martinez makes a desperate attempt to maintain ideological control by doubling down on her most extreme positions. Her response to the medical emergency reveals the authoritarian nature of academic activism when confronted with inconvenient reality. "Everyone needs to maintain discipline," Martinez announces through her megaphone to the remaining protesters. This is exactly how the military-industrial complex operates. They manufacture crises to justify violence. We cannot allow ourselves to be manipulated by these psychological warfare tactics. But Martinez's remaining supporters increasingly consist of only her graduate students, whose academic careers depend on supporting their advisors' research, and a handful of professional activists whose identity requires opposing anything connected to military personnel. The broader coalition of environmental activists, peace protesters, and concerned citizens has abandoned the demonstration. Jennifer Walsh becomes the voice of moral clarity that cuts through Martinez's academic rhetoric. "Professor, this isn't psychological warfare. This is a little girl who needs medical attention. I don't care about your theories anymore. I care about Emma Rodriguez." Walsh's public break with her professor creates a cascading effect as other students follow her example. They begin actively dismantling barriers and moving aside to create passage for the convoy, transforming from protesters into humanitarian volunteers. Shaw observes these developments with the tactical assessment of someone trained to recognize changing battlefield conditions. The hardline protest leadership maintains obstruction, but their support structure has collapsed. More importantly, civilian authorities finally have political cover to clear the remaining barriers without appearing to suppress legitimate protest. Sheriff Patricia Morrison, who has been monitoring the situation since early morning, recognizes the shift in public opinion and legal authority. The revelation of the convoy's humanitarian mission, combined with the medical emergency, provides clear justification for removing the remaining protesters under emergency authority statutes. Dr. Martinez, Sheriff Morrison approaches with professional courtesy, but unmistakable authority. "You have 5 minutes to remove your people from the roadway. We're clearing this route under emergency authority for disaster relief operations. Anyone remaining will be arrested for obstructing emergency services. Martinez's response demonstrates how academic activism can become disconnected from democratic norms. Sheriff, you're violating our First Amendment rights to peaceful protest. This is exactly the kind of state violence we're protesting against. Morrison's reply carries the weight of practical law enforcement experience. Doctor, you have the right to protest, but you don't have the right to block emergency medical supplies from reaching sick children. Your constitutional rights don't override public safety. The 5-minute deadline creates urgency that forces the remaining protesters to choose between arrest and allowing the convoy to pass. Most of Martinez's graduate students, facing potential criminal records that could destroy their academic careers, reluctantly move aside. Martinez and 3 hardcore activists maintain their position, chained to the concrete barriers in the roadway center. Their arrest occurs peacefully, but with maximum media coverage, creating the martyrdom narrative that Martinez has sought from the beginning. This is what resistance looks like. Martinez declares for news cameras as deputies cut her chains and place her under arrest. They're criminalizing protest to protect military violence. But the narrative no longer resonates with audiences who have learned about the convoy's humanitarian mission and Emma Rodriguez's medical emergency. Martinez's arrest appears to most observers as the consequence of extremism rather than the persecution of principled resistance. Shaw's convoy finally begins moving at 11:23 a.m., 4 hours and 8 minutes after the scheduled departure time. The delay has pushed their arrival in Northern California to mid-afternoon, extending the medical emergency and water shortage for thousands of flood victims. As the 12 trucks roll through Riverside Valley, a remarkable transformation occurs. Many of the former protesters line the roadway, applauding and cheering for the humanitarian mission they had been blocking hours earlier. Some hold hastily constructed signs reading, "Save Emma," and "Thank you for your service." Shaw maintains professional composure, but his staff recognizes the significance of the moment. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez observes, "Sir, this is probably the first time many of these civilians have seen military personnel in a purely humanitarian role. Might change some perspectives." The convoy's departure leaves Riverside Valley grappling with the aftermath of Martinez's ideological extremism. Local news coverage focuses on the community's ultimate support for the humanitarian mission, but questions remain about how academic activism led to blocking medical supplies for disaster victims. Sheriff Morrison's post-incident briefing provides official perspective on the morning's events. "We had a situation where legitimate protest rights conflicted with emergency operations. The community ultimately made the right choice by supporting disaster relief over ideological demonstration. The resolution creates multiple narratives about civilian-military relations, protest rights, and humanitarian priorities. Progressive activists struggle to defend Martinez's extremism, while conservative commentators use the incident to criticize anti-military activism generally. But for Shaw and his soldiers, the resolution simply means returning to their primary mission, delivering life-saving supplies to American families affected by natural disaster. The political drama in Riverside Valley becomes a footnote to the larger humanitarian operation. Dr. Foster's radio update confirms what everyone involved understands. Cherokee 6, Emma Rodriguez is stable but critical. Every hour of delay increases risk of permanent kidney damage. Your ETA is crucial for multiple patients experiencing dehydration complications. Shaw's response carries the weight of professional responsibility. Medical Center, Cherokee 6 rolling. We'll make up time en route. Those supplies will reach you today. The convoy disappears over the southern hills, leaving Riverside Valley to process the morning's events and their implications for future civilian-military relations in the community. The immediate aftermath of the convoy's departure reveals the true scope of Martinez's isolation from both her academic community and the broader public. Riverside Community College faces intense scrutiny over a tenured professor's role in blocking medical supplies to disaster victims, creating administrative headaches that extend far beyond the sociology department. College President Dr. Robert Chun receives dozens of calls from concerned parents, alumni, and community members questioning how an academic institution allowed a faculty member to organize obstruction of humanitarian relief. The negative publicity threatens the college's public funding and community relationships that took decades to build. Dr. Martinez's actions do not reflect the values of this institution. President Chun states in an emergency press conference, "While we support academic freedom and the right to peaceful protest, we cannot endorse activities that endanger public welfare or prevent emergency services from reaching disaster victims." The administrative response creates a clear distinction between legitimate academic inquiry and the extremist activism that Martinez represents. Several faculty members who initially supported her protest rights distanced themselves after learning about the convoy's humanitarian mission and the medical emergency her blockade created. Professor James Mitchell, who chairs the college's emergency management program, provides expert perspective that undermines Martinez's entire theoretical framework. There's a fundamental difference between protesting military interventions overseas and blocking disaster relief for American families. Dr. Martinez's inability to make that distinction raises serious questions about her academic judgment. Students who participated in the demonstration face their own reckoning as they process the gap between Martinez's rhetoric and the reality of blocking medical supplies. Jennifer Walsh becomes a spokesperson for students who feel manipulated by their professor's ideological extremism. "We thought we were protesting war and militarism," Walsh explains to campus media, "but we were actually preventing medical aid from reaching sick children. Dr. Martinez told us this was about resisting state violence, but we ended up creating violence against flood victims who needed help." The student response creates pressure for academic accountability that extends beyond the immediate incident. Several participants in Martinez's classes report feeling that their grades depend on supporting her political positions rather than engaging in genuine intellectual inquiry. Michael Torres files a formal complaint with the Academic Standards Committee, documenting how Martinez's courses require students to adopt specific ideological positions rather than develop critical thinking skills. She teaches activism disguised as academics, Torres explains. Students who question her theories about resisting militarism get lower grades, regardless of the quality of their analysis. The academic investigation reveals systematic problems with Martinez's teaching methodology that extend far beyond the morning's protest. Her courses consistently score poorly on anonymous evaluations, with students reporting that wrong political opinions result in grade penalties. Dr. Sarah Chun, Martinez's own graduate student, faces the collapse of her thesis research as the incident she documented becomes an example of academic extremism rather than principled resistance. Her committee now questions whether her research methodology has been compromised by ideological bias. "My thesis assumed that blocking military operations represents inherent moral good," Chen explains to her advisor committee. But this incident proves that assumption wrong. Military personnel sometimes conduct genuinely humanitarian missions that deserve community support, not ideological resistance. Chen's intellectual honesty forces a complete reevaluation of her graduate work and Martinez's academic influence. The incident becomes a case study in how ideological rigidity can corrupt scholarly inquiry and lead to morally bankrupt conclusions. Meanwhile, the legal consequences of Martinez's extremism begin materializing as federal authorities review the incident for potential criminal charges. Obstruction of disaster relief operations carries serious penalties under federal law, particularly when the obstruction delays medical aid to victims of declared disasters. James Harrison, the environmental lawyer who withdrew from the protest, faces professional review by the State Bar Association for his initial participation in obstructing emergency services. His legal practice specializes in environmental law, and association with blocking disaster relief threatens his professional reputation and client relationships. "I made a serious error in judgment by participating in Dr. Martinez's demonstration without thoroughly researching the convoy's mission," Harrison states in his Bar Association response. Environmental lawyers have a special responsibility to support disaster relief operations, not obstruct them. Harrison's professional consequences serve as a warning to other educated professionals about the risks of following academic activists into extremist positions without independent verification of facts. The community response in Riverside Valley reveals the depth of alienation that Martinez's actions have created between the college and local residents. Many community members who previously supported the institution now question whether it promotes anti-American extremism disguised as education. Mrs. Patterson, the retired nurse whose confrontation with Martinez became viral social media content, represents broader community sentiment. We've supported this college for decades, but we can't support professors who teach our children to block medical aid to sick kids. That's not education. That's indoctrination. The town council schedules emergency hearings to review the college's public funding and community partnerships. Several local businesses that provide internships and employment opportunities for students threaten to end their relationships with an institution that employs faculty like Martinez. Sheriff Morrison's incident report documents the resources required to manage Martinez's demonstration and the risks her extremism created for public safety. The report becomes evidence in ongoing discussions about academic accountability and the limits of protest rights. Dr. Martinez endangered public welfare by obstructing emergency services, Morrison's report concludes. Her actions created liability for the college and demonstrated contempt for basic humanitarian values that most citizens share regardless of political affiliation. The sheriff's findings provide official validation for community concerns about Martinez's extremism and its impact on public safety and civic responsibility. 4 hours behind schedule, Shaw's convoy finally reaches the Northern California disaster zone at 3:47 p.m., immediately beginning the supply distribution that should have started before noon. The delay has had measurable consequences for flood victims, but the humanitarian mission proceeds with military efficiency that demonstrates the true purpose Martinez's ideology forced her to ignore. Dr. Amanda Foster's medical team receives the convoy's pediatric supplies with visible relief, immediately beginning treatment protocols that require the specialized equipment Shaw's trucks have been carrying since dawn. Emma Rodriguez, the 7-year-old whose medical emergency became the focal point of the morning standoff, represents dozens of patients whose conditions deteriorated during the delay. Colonel Shaw, these 4 fluids and electrolyte solutions are exactly what we needed 4 hours ago, Dr. Foster reports as medical personnel unload emergency supplies. Emma's kidneys are showing stress markers that could have been prevented with earlier intervention. Every hour of delay in these situations multiplies medical complications. The clinical assessment provides concrete measurement of Martinez's ideological extremism's human cost. Emma's potential long-term kidney damage represents the price of academic activism that treats humanitarian missions as military propaganda, regardless of actual purpose or urgent medical necessity. Shaw coordinates the supply distribution with the same professional competence he brought to the morning's protest negotiations. His soldiers work efficiently to establish water purification systems, distribute medical supplies, and coordinate with civilian emergency management officials who have been waiting hours for crucial equipment. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez documents the operations timeline for after-action reports that will analyze the protest's impact on mission effectiveness. Sir, the 4-hour delay pushed several critical patients beyond optimal treatment windows. Civic responsibility. 6 months after the incident that changed everything, Colonel Shaw receives a handwritten letter from Carmen Rodriguez that captures the human impact of professional dedication overcoming ideological obstruction. The letter, written in careful English with occasional Spanish phrases, represents authentic gratitude from a family whose daughter's life was saved by military humanitarian mission. Dear Colonel Shaw and all the soldiers, Carmen writes, Emma is healthy now and back in school. The doctors say her kidneys are working good and she will be okay. We pray for you every night because you brought the medicine that saved our little girl. We don't understand why people try to stop you, but we are grateful you didn't give up on helping us. The letter includes a crayon drawing from Emma herself, stick figures labeled soldiers, carrying medical supplies to a hospital where a small girl lies in bed. Her childish artwork captures the moral clarity that Martinez's academic theories couldn't obscure: uniformed personnel delivering life-saving aid to sick children. Shaw shares the letter with his soldiers during a unit formation, emphasizing the humanitarian mission that defines their domestic operations. "This is why we serve," he tells the assembled troops. "Not for political recognition or ideological validation, but for families like the Rodriguez family who need our help during emergencies." The Rodriguez family's gratitude provides moral validation that transcends political debates about civilian-military relations. Their authentic appreciation demonstrates the human value of military humanitarian capabilities when ideology doesn't obstruct practical necessity. Dr. Martinez faces the collapse of her academic career as criminal charges, tenure review, and professional isolation converge around her extremist actions. Federal prosecutors ultimately decide against criminal charges due to First Amendment considerations, but academic and professional consequences prove equally devastating. Riverside Community College's tenure review committee votes to revoke Martinez's permanent status and terminate her employment, citing violation of professional standards, damage to institutional reputation, and demonstration of judgment so poor it disqualifies her from educational responsibility. Dr. Martinez's actions brought discredit to this institution and violated the public trust that supports higher education, the committee concludes. Her obstruction of medical supplies to disaster victims demonstrates moral judgment incompatible with educational mission. Martinez's termination creates precedent for academic accountability when faculty extremism endangers public welfare and corrupts educational purpose. Her case becomes cautionary tale studied in academic freedom courses that examine the boundaries between legitimate scholarly inquiry and dangerous ideological activism. Professional consequences extend throughout academia as Martinez's research becomes associated with extremism that ignores evidence and prioritizes ideology over humanitarian concern. Her published work on resisting militarism is removed from several academic journals whose editors question scholarship that led to obstructing medical aid to children. The incident transforms civilian-military relations in Riverside Valley as community members gain direct experience with military humanitarian capabilities and professional competence. Local attitudes toward the nearby base shift from suspicion to appreciation as residents understand the positive role uniformed personnel play during emergencies. Sheriff Morrison organizes joint training exercises between civilian emergency services and military disaster response units, creating cooperation frameworks that prevent future ideological obstruction of humanitarian operations. The collaboration produces community emergency plans that integrate military capabilities with civilian needs. The morning's events taught us that military personnel often serve humanitarian purposes that deserve community support. Morrison explains during joint training announcement. "We're building relationships that protect both civilian rights and emergency response effectiveness." The sheriff's initiative creates model for civilian-military cooperation that other communities adopt, demonstrating how crisis can produce positive institutional change when extremist obstacles are overcome. Jennifer Walsh, the student who broke with Martinez's extremism, becomes campus leader advocating for educational reform that emphasizes critical thinking over ideological conformity. Her experience with academic manipulation motivates advocacy for intellectual honesty in classroom instruction. Students deserve education that teaches them how to think, not what to think, Walsh explains in campus newspaper editorial. Dr. Martinez's courses required adopting her political positions rather than developing analytical skills. That's indoctrination, not education. Walsh's advocacy leads to curriculum reforms that emphasize evidence-based inquiry over predetermined ideological conclusions. Her courage in confronting extremist authority becomes model for student intellectual independence and moral courage. Michael Torres completes environmental science degree with research project examining successful integration of military and civilian capabilities during natural disasters. His work demonstrates how environmental protection and emergency response can cooperate rather than conflict when ideology doesn't create artificial obstacles. Military units like Colonel Shaw's battalion provide crucial environmental restoration capabilities during disasters, Torres concludes in his thesis. Their water purification systems, environmental assessment teams, and infrastructure repair capabilities serve environmental protection goals during emergencies. Torres's research provides academic foundation for understanding military environmental mission that Martinez's ideology prevented her from recognizing. His work becomes required reading in environmental studies programs that examine emergency response and disaster recovery. The broader community transformation extends beyond Riverside Valley as the incident receives national attention and becomes case study in academic institutions throughout the country. Universities develop policies preventing faculty from using institutional resources to organize obstruction of emergency services. Dr. Sarah Chun completes her graduate work under new supervision that emphasizes scholarly rigor over activist ideology. Her revised thesis examines how ideological extremism can corrupt academic inquiry and lead to positions that violate basic humanitarian values. The incident revealed how theoretical frameworks can become rigid ideologies that prevent scholars from recognizing evidence contradicting predetermined conclusions, Chun writes in her final analysis. Academic inquiry requires intellectual flexibility that extremist activism cannot provide. Chen's work contributes to growing academic literature about ideological corruption of scholarly research and the importance of evidence-based methodology over political activism disguised as education. Colonel Shaw continues humanitarian operations throughout the Pacific Northwest, building civilian relationships that demonstrate military commitment to community service and emergency response. His unit becomes model for civilian-military cooperation that serves public welfare while respecting democratic institutions. The 47th Engineering Battalion's community outreach programs include disaster preparedness training, emergency response exercises, and educational presentations that help civilians understand military humanitarian capabilities. Shaw's leadership creates trust that prevents future ideological obstruction of legitimate missions. Emma Rodriguez celebrates her 8th birthday with full recovery from the medical crisis that nearly cost her life, unaware that her emergency became catalyst for broader discussions about academic responsibility and civilian-military cooperation in American communities. Her healthy laughter during family celebrations represents ultimate validation of Shaw's mission and condemnation of Martinez's extremism. The child whose medical emergency was dismissed as military propaganda embodies the human cost of ideological rigidity that ignores humanitarian need. The story concludes with recognition that sometimes justice comes not through punishment of extremists, but through community transformation that chooses practical cooperation over theoretical opposition, humanitarian service over ideological purity, and evidence-based thinking over predetermined political conclusions. In Riverside Valley, where protesters once blocked military trucks carrying medical supplies, annual emergency preparedness exercises now feature civilian-military cooperation that serves community welfare and demonstrates how professional competence can overcome ideological extremism when human need requires practical solutions.